Today is September the 23rd, 1978, and I'm speaking with Mrs. Emma Corcoran, who worked at Ellis Island from 1904 until 1916.
I think it was about 1909 when I started to work for Mr. Ewell. Byron H. Ewell was the assistant commissioner then. I had a buzzer on my desk from the commissioner's office and a bell from Mr. Ewell. There were a great many people there, there were about 500 employees then. We took the 440 boat. It was a very lovely view. I used to love the sunsets at this time of year. You see, we'd be going across just when the sun was setting, and it was really beautiful. And the harbor there, I love that. I really loved Ellis Island.
Ellis Island is really the symbol of America's first great wave of immigration.
It really symbolizes what it meant to travel from far away, to enter the golden doors of America, as they often called them, and start on a new journey in this liminal space in the New York harbor, where you then entered the city of Manhattan.
As an agency, USCIS is not very old.
We really look back to Ellis Island and we see that as the beginning of our jobs. Today we use different programs that did not exist at Ellis Island, but these were all developed because of the experience of immigrants at Ellis Island and the need for the federal government to vet and process immigrants in a way that ensures America's safety, but also brings these immigrants in an efficient and also heartfelt manner.
In the last decades of the 19th century, increasing numbers of immigrants arrived on America's shores. At the time, immigration was largely regulated by the states.
Castle Garden was originally run by the state of New York, and then as the tide of immigration increased, it really became too overwhelming of a situation for New York.
Several laws enacted during the 1880s increased the federal government's role in regulating immigration. To better administer federal immigration policies, Congress eventually passed the Immigration Act of 1891, which placed immigration under federal control. This law also created a new federal office that was later named the Bureau of Immigration and charged it with overseeing the admission of immigrants. To inspect immigrants arriving in the United States, the Bureau of Immigration opened the Ellis Island Immigration Station in New York Harbor on January 2, 1892.
And this is where you can really see Castle Garden as representing the state's control of immigration, and then how with Ellis Island and the Immigration Service, it became taken over by the federal authorities.
Ellis Island started out physically a lot smaller than it is today. It was about 3 1/3 acres. Once the federal government got the island, they started enlarging it. The final size was 27.5 acres.
Ellis Island included an inspection hall, hearing and detention rooms, hospitals, cafeterias, administrative offices, a railroad ticket office, and space for immigrant aid societies.
And it's kind of modeled after a train station, because that would be the closest comparable type of building that thousands of people would be going through every day.
By 1893, Ellis Island employed 119 of the Immigration Service's entire staff of 180. Familiar procedures, such as inspection, hearings, appeals, deportation, verification for naturalization, and other agency functions that are actually still used today, all began on Ellis Island during these early years.
The Immigration Service was anxious that every immigrant come through a place like Ellis Island and be legally inspected by a U.S. immigrant inspector and pass inspection and be admitted to the United States. Then the person would be lawfully in this country. And those who avoided it were people that the Immigration Service was very, very anxious to get a hold of.
Only about 20% of the immigrants that came through were held for additional questioning. Of the 20% that were held for further questioning, only about 2% of those were actually eventually deported. In 1906, the Immigration Service was joined by the Naturalization Service. And together they eventually became the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS.
We also need to remember that Ellis Island really symbolizes one of many immigration stations. And also all of those federal employees who worked in Washington, D.C.
In the early years, Ellis Island was actually handling more immigrants than any other port or any border crossing. Eventually, there were over 200 immigrant stations or substations of the Immigration Service nationwide. But because of Ellis Island's importance, the Commissioner General in Washington, who was the highest official of the Immigration Service, his salary was less than the Commissioner of Immigration at Ellis Island, who actually is dealing with the mass immigration.
Hour after hour, shipload after shipload, day after day. The stream of human beings with its kaleidoscopic variations was then hurried along through Ellis Island by the equivalent of Step Lively in every language on earth. Victor Stafford, an Immigration Service employee starting in 1895.
The Immigration Service was the responsible agency on this island. So in terms of hierarchy, of course, the bosses were the commissioner, who was a presidential appointee, and then the assistant commissioner, also a presidential appointee. And then there was the superintendent. He was like a manager of the whole island. Then under that would be the chief inspectors of each division. And then under them would be all of the immigrant inspectors under them, and then under that, the interpreters. And meanwhile, there was another group of officials that was the clerical staff, run by the chief clerk, who was another powerful official here on Ellis Island. For many years, Augustus Sherman was the chief clerk, and he's famous for his photographs of immigrants in detention in immigrant costume.
Mr. Sherman was our chief clerk, and he was a man who was very interested in a great many things, including photography. And whenever there were unusually attractive or different immigrants, they called on Mr. Sherman to take their pictures, and he did.
Generally speaking, there were 12 divisions, 12 bureaucratic divisions that were structured by Commissioner Williams in 1903 here. All of these different divisions There usually were inspectors in those divisions. You started as an assistant inspector, like a probationary. Then if you were good enough, you became a full U.S. inspector.
They graded it as first grade civil service. At that time, I think the immigrant inspectors got about $1,800 a year, which was considered awfully good pay in 1904.
The highest regarded or more important position was United States inspector, immigrant inspector. If he was assigned to the boarding division, he would come in about 6 o'clock in the morning, report to the battery in the barge office building where the Immigration Service ran the boarding division. He would check the ticker tape machine to see what telegraph reports were coming in from the movements of ships, what ships were on time in the harbor that morning or that day.
The immigrant inspector and the customs inspector went down the harbor in a government tug. The government had tugboats in New York Harbor, and they went down the harbor to Quarantine, which was on an island just outside of the Narrows there. And they boarded the ship by rope ladders, because the ships didn't dock there.
And they would then meet the captain and the surgeon and the chief purser. They'd have them swear to the truth of the manifest. And then they would go into a big saloon aboard ship as the ship slowly docked, and they would start interviewing first-class passengers, cabin passengers, not immigrants mostly. These were wealthy people who were visiting the United States. They would quickly finish them, and then they would go through second-class passengers who were more middle-class people, and just the aliens. They would clear a release to discharge all U.S. citizens on the ship, and then they would have all of the steerage passengers and immigrants tagged to match their names on the passenger list, their page number, name, and all that information, so they could identify them.
And then the steerage passengers were kept on board ship until the island was ready to take them. Some days there were 5,000 and 10,000 people in port, and it took a lot of managing, I imagine, but they brought them over on barges to the island. And then they marched in the building in that picture that I have there. That's the entrance of the immigrants. And then they went up the stairway to the second floor, was where the examination took place. And there were doctors. There were doctors who were looking for eye trouble and for physical defects and illness, lack of good health and things like that. And if they had any doubt, they'd chalk mark the immigrants. The main floor was divided into sort of aisles, and there were benches along the side. And at the end of each one of these was an immigrant inspector, an interpreter.
So the registry inspectors would examine everyone. They would do about 200 or 300 people until they had a break, and then another inspector would take over. And they would stand or sit at podium desks in the Great Hall. There were about 8 to 12 different lines in which they were the head of the line, these inspectors.
And they had the ship's manifest in front of them. Generally, all the information on the ship's manifest was checked by the immigrant inspector.
Most immigrants were very briefly questioned. The inspector's job was to verify the information as recorded in Europe on the passenger list by the pursers.
And they checked the answers that ran. They asked the immigrant his name and his occupation, and who paid his passage was the main question, and how much money he had, and he had to show what he had, and his race. Of course, race and nationality were kept very distinct. And then his destination, and it's a loaded question if he had a job waiting for him, and that wasn't good if he did, because the contract labor law is quite strict about that.
Generally speaking, they try to get through the line as quickly as possible, and most people were admitted on the spot. They were not detained. They were trying to avoid unnecessary detentions because there weren't enough beds to house thousands of detainees.
The doctors, if they found a defect, issued a medical certificate, we used to call it. If there was a medical certificate, well, it was pretty certain that the inspector would hold the immigrant, for further examination. So then there were 3 things that happened to the immigrant. He was either admitted, he was temporarily detained, or he was held for special inquiry.
This is the hearing room, or one of several hearing rooms, where there would be a board of special inquiry. About 10% of the immigrants wound up in a room like this.
A board of special inquiry consisted of 3 inspectors, an interpreter, and a secretary. And on rare occasions, I acted as secretary. That is, when the immigration was so terrifically heavy, they would have to make up new extra boards. And on some occasions, I did act in that. And it was very interesting. And it was almost like a trial, you know. They could, their relatives could appear.
They could get affidavits of support from their family. Their family could take out a bond on their admission.
They checked on the physical defect and things like that, and how it affected the alien's ability to earn a living. And then, of course, the board either admitted them or ordered them deported, either one or the other. Well, then, of course, if the immigrants were excluded, unless it was a mandatory thing, they had the right of appeal to Washington. And the appeals were all heard by Mr. Ewell. That was his regular job. Each day, there was a group of immigrants outside of Mr. Ewell's office, and they were brought in, and he interviewed them. Very sad when they had to go back. Very sad. Everybody felt sorry when they had to. You know, people there did too, but the law was the law.
The United States Bureau of Immigration hired a large staff of employees. There are generally about 400 to 700 employees that worked for the Immigration Service.
There were guards, immigrant inspectors, and of course there were clerks, custodial workers. There were matrons, because they had to serve the needs of the female immigrants. Oh, I mustn't forget the laborers, and there were many of them. There were medical personnel attached, because they had to examine but I believe that they were on the staff of the Public Health Service.
The Public Health Service assisted the Immigration Bureau in certain areas where medical specialty was required. They had just an extremely large staff as the years went by and things became more complex. They hired a lawyer, they had accountants here, they had special inspectors that could be detailed to investigate. There was a telegraph service. They dealt with the quarantine service. They had to bring in all kinds of advisors and consultants. And they also had to do a lot of building. They were pressured here on the island to increase the staff as needed. So it was quite an operation, very involved and complex. The workforce was so diverse. You know, you had old-time Americans from generations back to colonial times. There were many that were foreign-born or immigrants who were naturalized citizens. So you had a really diverse staff, and you also had some social class diversity, educational diversity among the workforce.
There is no greater sphere of work in the United States for the honest, loyal, patriotic American citizen than in the Immigration Service. I do not mean just the Commissioner General at Washington, nor the commissioners at the various ports of entry, but the inspectors on the examining line, the clerks in the offices, the watchmen at the doors, the matrons in the divisions. Maud Mosher, an Immigration Service matron at Ellis Island, starting in 1903.
After 1924, a lot of the immigrant inspection actually took place abroad. So immigrants who came here were immigrants who needed to be detained for a certain reason.
And you must remember that after I had begun to work in 1929 and later years, the bulk of the immigrants had already arrived. But there were still many coming in.
So in 1925, after the quota laws were now in full force, many employees were furloughed or dismissed if they were not permanent, or sent to other stations to work.
Well, I would say the morale was mixed. I kept on plugging, working, doing my work day in and day out. There were quite a few of us not satisfied with the very low salaries that we were getting, which were not keeping pace with salaries in other agencies. But aside from that, we did get a chance to get promoted by taking tests for higher positions, immigrant inspector, for instance, or naturalization examiner.
So during the late 1920s, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, fewer and fewer immigrants were being processed through Ellis Island.
After the Second World War started, we would get visitors from military agencies and say, could you find this for me? Could you find the record of arrival of this former immigrant? It was for intelligence purposes.
As had been the case during the First World War, World War II caused the government to utilize Ellis Island for purposes other than an immigration station. The complex served as a detention center and a Coast Guard training station.
By the 1950s, it was primarily a detention center. By 1954, the need for Ellis Island had decreased.
After Ellis Island closed in 1954, it lay dormant for many years, and it really became a forgotten symbol of America's immigrant history.
Not until really 1976, with the bicentennial celebration of the United States, that people began to become more interested in Ellis Island and the country's immigrant history. The restoration began in the 1980s, and by 1990, the Ellis Island National Park was open.
For many years, the Ellis Island was looked upon as this rather depressing, threatening place of the INS. This was the way they could keep you in isolation, and which they did. Especially after the 20s onward, when Ellis Island becomes more of a detention and deportation site. By the time of the closing, though, the press and the media begins to wax kind of nostalgic about it.
Ellis Island has become a prominent and iconic symbol of the nation's immigrant heritage, and it continues to represent the long legacy that USCIS carries on to this day.
There are a lot of myths about Ellis Island. One big myth is that people were given citizenship here. In the days this was open, no one was ever naturalized here. Often our visitors get confused. They think immigrants in the past, on arrival, were actually given citizenship, or that they would come back and get their citizenship here. Possibly because of the recent naturalization ceremonies, which are appropriate for today, but they do occasionally confuse visitors.
So another common misconception that people have about Ellis Island is that immigrant inspectors changed people's names when they arrived at Ellis Island.
It's actually a myth that I grew up with. Names were not changed here at Ellis Island. They were written down in Europe.
The passengers would supply that information to the shipping companies in Europe. The ship's purser would then record that information on the ship's passenger list. That passenger list would then be provided to the Immigration Service. But oftentimes, when they settled in the United States, because people had problems pronouncing their names, they would change their names shortly after immigrating. That timeline was often shortened so that when people say my name was changed on Ellis Island, they mean that their name was changed in the immigration process.
And that's one of the things our office, the history office at USCIS, likes to do. We like to dispel these myths and really get back to the truth of what we find in the documents and at the archives.
Well, people come to Ellis Island primarily to get kind of in touch personally with the immigrant history of the United States and the people that came to Ellis Island, mostly from Europe. They're very fascinated with the story of Ellis Island, the mass immigration of the period. The average visitor would be very interested, and is interested, in knowing about the men and women that worked here. Because people were very curious about the rooms in this building and about what they were used for. And they really want to feel that they are going back in time and they can get a feel from an age long past. As a part of that prospect is the real reality of the men and women that worked at Ellis Island. They would like to know that. Many people do ask questions about the employees here.
I think the biggest thing visitors want to know about the Ellis Island employees is, how were my relatives treated?
It's clear that the inspectors, the interpreters, the clerks, and the guards, and all these kind of people, the personnel were really fascinating, and they're really so much a part of the island story. And people realize that. They feel that the dramatic element, certainly it does include the employee. This was often an unforgettable part of an employee's career.
The INS changed names and went to various places within the government over the years. But by 2003, that was the agency from which USCIS was created. So in many ways, as an agency, we can trace our history back here to Ellis Island.
Ellis Island has a lot of personal and professional significance for USCIS employees today. I really think of Ellis Island as this site of memory that represents USCIS's long history and legacy with federal immigration policy.
Each day we sent the steamship company bills for the immigrants who would arrive. And it seemed to me it was $8 a piece. I love those ships. And we got so we knew, goodness, when they came up the harbor, we knew what line they belonged to and the name of the ship, because we got so familiar with them. They were beautiful.